So, those moments that don't seem like a big deal at the time, but something about them, it just lingers with you. So, like maybe the other person said something that didn't sit quite right with you, or they gave you a look that made your stomach drop. But you couldn't put your finger on why exactly. But even though you brushed it off and convinced yourself it was fine, it stayed with you. But now, with some space, you keep coming back to those moments and starting to realize that they weren't nothing after all. They were warnings. You just didn't have the language for them yet. And if that's something you've been struggling with, those lingering feelings, I put together a quiz that might help you. It's linked below and it can give you a sense of why your nervous system still feels stuck, even now. My name is Christina, and in this video, we're walking through some of the strangest red flags I see. And they're strange because they don't seem like red flags at all in the moment. But in hindsight, it all becomes crystal clear. So let's start with number one, when praise was really pressure. So I can't tell you how many women I've talked to that have been called mature for their age growing up. And yes, this is a problem that seems to be specific with women. If you're a man and you've dealt with this, please do let me know in the comments. But at least from my experience, I don't hear men getting told that very often. But the women I've known who've experienced this, they were told that they were old souls, not in a sweet way, but because these women were the ones picking up the emotional slack in a house full of chaos. So, one woman I worked with in particular, her dad used to unload on her after fights with her mom. He'd tell her, "You're the only one in this family who really gets it." She was 9 at the time. And the wild thing is that she carried that into adulthood like it was a good thing, the badge of the old soul. And she ended up in a relationship where the guy called her his rock. He'd say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And he really leaned on her. And at first, it felt kind of comforting. Like maybe this time, being the strong one would finally be enough. But it didn't take long before she realized what he really meant was, "I'm gonna lean on you so I don't have to hold myself up." And the minute she asked for something, whether it's support or clarity or a little basic emotional effort, he either shut down or turned it around on her. And suddenly, she was too much, too needy, or not like she used to be, when she was doing all that propping up. And all of this is confusing because it doesn't feel like a red flag when someone tells you how important you are to them. But when their version of love depends on you never needing anything back, that is not love, that's a role. And the second you stop performing it, the entire thing falls apart. So now let's talk about the second warning sign. When you felt the shift but had no proof. You know that feeling when someone walks into the room and the air changes? They don't have to say anything. You just know something's off. I had a client, let's call her Sarah, who used to say her ex could change the temperament of the room without even raising his voice. She'd come home from work and within seconds, she could tell whether it was going to be a safe night or one where she'd have to walk on eggshells. And there was no shouting or no slamming doors. Now, when she said safe, she meant emotionally safe, not physically safe. But nonetheless, she knew there were going to be landmines that she would have to sidestep. And for her husband, maybe that was just silence or a sigh that lasted a little too long. Maybe it was the way he'd scroll on his phone without looking up when she walked in. And none of these things were enough to count as mistreatment, not in the way most people define it. And when she brought it up, he'd say, "I literally didn't say anything." Right? When you're giving the silent treatment, it's really easy to fall back on that as a rebuttal. So, yes, you literally didn't say anything, and that is the problem. And he would always say something like, "You're reading into this." And honestly, that would make her feel worse because she was kind of reading into it, but not in the way he meant. Her body had learned to pick up on the smallest cues to stay ahead of the storm. Even though the storm was quiet, it still very much felt like a storm. So the sigh, the quiet way the silverware hit the counter, all of it became a language her nervous system understood better than her brain did. So when people say, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" or "Why didn't you just say something?" it's because the warning signs weren't loud. They were quiet and subtle, and they were easily dismissed. And if this applies to you, maybe you did say something, but it was dismissed because it was something small. And this is where I always bring in that phrase, death by a thousand paper cuts. In these relationships, there usually are some big things, but really the stuff that gets to you over time is the little stuff because it happens every single day, multiple times a day. It's a way that you're dismissed and treated like you don't matter. And then when you try to bring it up, you're dismissed yet again. So let's move on to the next. When you realized you were being careful, but couldn't explain why. So I had this moment once where I was in the middle of telling a story, just some dumb thing that happened in line at the grocery store. And halfway through, I caught myself wondering if my partner was even listening. And I'm not just talking about distracted listening. These days, unfortunately, it's pretty common for some of us to be looking on our phones while someone else is talking to you. What I'm talking about is when they're judging you, or you get the feeling they're thinking you're annoying, or they're already halfway out the door in their head. So in this moment, I decided to cut the story short and I laughed. Like, I just realized that it wasn't really that interesting. Which, to be honest, it probably wasn't. But that's not the point. The point is, I didn't feel free to just be myself around this person. Not even in small everyday moments like that. And of course, I'm not saying that this one instance was a big deal. It absolutely wasn't. But what it is an example of how you feel around someone who treats you like you don't matter. So, no, you don't have to listen to every story about being at the grocery store. But when the overwhelming theme is that you don't matter, even little moments like that can make you feel small. Because what happens is over time, you start keeping things to yourself. And I'm not talking about big secrets or anything, just little everyday stuff. So maybe thoughts or jokes, funny things that you think of, you just decide not to say because you feel like you're going to be ignored. Really, over time, you start to choose silent because it feels safer. It feels less disappointing and less embarrassing. And when I was in that situation, nobody told me to do that. There wasn't like a big fight over these silly little conversations or about me being myself. There was no ultimatum or some huge blow up. It just happened quietly where I just stopped being myself around this person. And that's what makes it so hard to spot. When someone who makes you feel like being yourself is too much or not enough, you don't always fight back. Sometimes you just adjust. And it looks like you're being chill or easygoing, but really, you're just trying not to get hurt. So now let's talk about the next one when everyone else thought you were the problem. So I have a little story that can help illustrate this one. I was out to dinner with a friend and her husband, and it was just the three of us. And at dinner, he was really friendly and outgoing. He was cracking jokes and making the waiter laugh, and he was over ordering appetizers, kind of like being the life of the party. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think like, wow, what a great guy. While she, on the other hand, was very quiet. And she barely spoke unless someone asked her something directly. She smiled, but it was that polite, shut down kind of smile. And I could tell something was really off. If I hadn't known her, really known her, I probably would have assumed that she was the problem, that she was cold or rude, or just really didn't want to be there. But I did know her, and I could feel what was going on. And later she told me that he screamed at her the whole way there. And it was over something completely ridiculous. And at least according to her, she really didn't have much to say in response. She was just berated the entire time, picked apart until she was in tears in the passenger seat. And then she had to walk into the restaurant like nothing happened. And of course, at that point, she had to pull herself together. She had to smile for the server and sit across from the man who humiliated her 20 minutes earlier. And that's the part that most people don't see. They don't see the car ride. They don't see the slow unraveling that happened before the photo was taken or before the friends arrived, before the party started. They just see the quiet, withdrawn person next to the charming one and think they've got the story figured out. But most of the time, they don't. So now let's talk about when the jokes started to feel like little cuts. Here come those paper cuts again. So I was talking to someone not long ago, and he'd been married to a woman who, on the surface, came off as strong, witty, and really put together. And honestly, she really was. But he shared with me that when they were around friends, she had this habit of making these little comments about him. And she always framed them as a joke. Like someone would ask if he cooks, for example, and she'd say something like, "Yeah, if you count burning water as cooking." But I knew the guy and I knew he actually could kind of cook and he enjoyed doing it. So that comment was pretty cutting for him. And when they were out, if he said something that she didn't agree with, she'd laugh and say, "Oh, babe, don't embarrass yourself." And one time she made an entire toast at a dinner party that was basically a roast of all the things she thought he was doing wrong in his life. So she brought up his job, his hobbies, even the way he folded laundry. And everyone laughed because she was charismatic and quick witted. And she said it all with a smile. It's just a joke after all, right? And he laughed too, because what else do you do when everyone's watching and you feel about this tall? He told me later that he'd brush all those things off, but those comments always embarrassed him. And it wasn't that he couldn't take a joke, he could, but it wasn't just a joke, it was a pattern. And every time he tried to bring it up, she'd act like he was being fragile or dramatic. She would tell him he's so sensitive and he needs to man up. And unfortunately, it worked. He stopped bringing that stuff up. And eventually, he stopped expecting her to do anything different. And that's what this kind of thing does, it rewrites what you think you deserve. Because when the people around you are laughing and you're the only one who's not, you start to wonder if maybe the problem is you. But it's not. So now let's talk about when every boundary turned into a debate. And I hear this all the time. Someone will tell me they asked for something absolutely simple, like, "Don't raise your voice with me," or "I need space to calm down before we talk." No outrageous requests, just basic human boundaries. And the response is never just, "Okay." It turns into a thing. And suddenly the person is defending why they need their boundaries, or being told again they're too sensitive, or that they're shutting the other person out. And after a while, they stop trying to set the boundaries. Not because they stopped caring about the boundary or their personal space, but because saying it out loud started to feel harder than just letting it slide. It's this pattern I see all the time where people know exactly what they need, but they're made to feel like they're asking for too much. And they're not even close. And here's the thing, it's not that their boundaries were unclear, it's that they were never going to be respected in the first place. And when that happens enough times, it starts to feel easier just to stay quiet because really the alternative feels like banging your head against a wall. So now let's talk about when the bare minimum starts to feel like a gift. So I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who've told me about moments that on the surface sounded sweet. So maybe something like, "He texted me back right away," or "She apologized without even being asked." This can also look like they finally showed up on time, they didn't interrupt me while I was speaking, or they actually gave me a real hug. And people tend to say this with a strange mix of relief and guilt. Like they're excited, but also kind of embarrassed that something so small felt like an actual breakthrough. But that's what happens when your nervous system's been trained to live on edge. When things are chaotic or emotionally unpredictable for long enough, even the absence of harm can feel like love. And when someone finally does the bare minimum, it feels huge. You know it's not supposed to be this way. You know that responding kindly or taking responsibility or listening without turning it back on you, it shouldn't be rare. But when it is, you start grabbing onto it like proof. Like, maybe this means they're finally changing. But that's the moment you realize you're only praising crumbs because you're starving. And if any of this hit close to home, talking about those weird little moments that just didn't feel like much at the time, but kept coming back now that you know better, watch this video right here where I share the red flags you felt in your body, but were trained to ignore. And be sure to give this video right here a like before you go if you haven't already. And I'll see you next time.